Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and good night, depending when and where you are joining us from around in the world. Welcome to another video by Decrypting Crypto and Breakout Solutions. My name is Wasim. Today, I want to speak to you about 21 cool things that have happened in El Salvador over the year of 2022 that prove that El Salvador moving to Bitcoin as being legal tender was the right move for the country. Now, prior to 2021, when El Salvador made Bitcoin legal tender in September of 2021, El Salvador was known as the murder capital of the world. It's a small, tiny country in Latin America that not many people know of and was known to be a dangerous place to go and a dangerous place to visit. El Salvador's history has been plagued with corruption, has been plagued with civil war, and so much more. It's a small country that has around 2.5 million people population and has a huge number of gangs and had a high number of homicides. However, back in September 2021, El Salvador moved over to having Bitcoin as legal tender. This was hailed as a big celebration, as a big win for Bitcoiners and crypto enthusiasts all around the world, because we believe that Bitcoin may become one day the world reserve currency. Since then, we had another country that has taken Bitcoin as legal tender, being the Central African Republic. We've also had Lugano, which is a Swiss city on the border between Switzerland and Italy, that has turned Bitcoin into a de facto legal tender. Without any further ado, let's look into what has happened in El Salvador over 2022. I found a tweet by the Bitcoin office, which is the office of Bitcoin from El Salvador by President Nayib Bukele. So I'm going to share my screen and show you guys what they spoke about and go into detail to some of the things that have happened over there. So let's go over to Twitter. This is the tweet that was done by El Salvador, that was done by the Bitcoin office on the 31st of December 2022. As you can see, they're pointing out 21 of the cool things that have happened in El Salvador. Number one, they've rebranded the country. El Salvador used to be known as the capital murder of the world. Now, when you type in El Salvador in Google, you get El Salvador Bitcoin, El Salvador capital, El Salvador currency. So you can see the number one is El Salvador Bitcoin. So since then, El Salvador has rebranded and has been known as a country, and the population is now believes that they are in fact not too small to become big. And since then, they've had a lot of media coverage. In fact, President Bukele has been on multiple live streams and multiple TV shows where he speaks about El Salvador and what they've done. And in this video with Tucker Carlson, he speaks about that this was one of the greatest rebranding in history and it cost him nothing. Because of all the cool things that they're doing, they've had millions of visitors coming. They've had an increase in tourism. They've had a lot of attention being turned to a small Latin American country. The number of homicides in El Salvador has decreased, while President Bukele has focused solely in the majority of 2022 at imprisoning and capturing gangs and reducing gang violence. And they've actually achieved one of their first ever days where they had zero homicides. The country was plagued with a lot of homicides, a lot of gang violence prior to this because of all the corruption of previous governments. So with security came tourism, with over 2.4 million people arriving in El Salvador as tourists, bringing in over $2.4 billion in revenue to the country. And even it was written about in the Telegraph in the UK as the most underrated winter sun option on Earth. When I bring that up, I'll bring this article up, and you can see here, this writer who writes about tourism spoke about that he actually never thought about going to El Salvador or was worried because he was told it was one of the most dangerous countries, and the capital of El Salvador was the most murderous city of the world. However, after doing a bit more research and with the reduction in homicide and the crackdown on gang violence in El Salvador, he decided to visit El Salvador and found it to be, in his words, I found it to be beautiful in some parts and begriling in awe. So he found El Salvador was a very, very beautiful country. He visited many areas, looked at the history, and so moving on. With security also came diaspora, which means that a lot of people who left El Salvador during the civil wars and during the time when there was corruption and people just couldn't make it in El Salvador because it was a third world country, a very, very poor country. But now with the move towards Bitcoin becoming legal tender, a lot of people who have moved out of El Salvador, their children are now going back to their homeland and getting their own IDs. And you can see this by this guy, Gerson Martinez, who said that he, after 40 years since his parents left the country, he went back to his home country and got his national ID. So when President Bukele addressed the United Nations, he spoke about that he's there to speak about peace. And he also, there's a full YouTube video, which we'll leave the link for in the bio, and a link to this whole Twitter thread. He speaks about that one of the challenges that El Salvador has been facing is a lot of the larger countries have been creating a lot of negative news and saying that El Salvador is going to default on their debt and they shouldn't be doing this. The IMF has weighed in on that, with multiple articles in mainstream media talking negatively about El Salvador taking Bitcoin as legal tender. However, what he speaks about here is rich countries cannot enforce their laws and their values onto other countries when they try to do the best thing for their people. He gives the example that if there's two neighbors, one's rich, one's poor, and the rich neighbor's got a beautiful house and got all the things that they need for them, and then the poorer neighbor now starts to try and better themselves and fix their house. The rich neighbor cannot stir up a stick and say, hey, you can't be doing this, which is what wealthy nations have been doing with El Salvador. They're trying to say that, their move to Bitcoin was wrong and they're going to default. And, they've put out many, many warnings to detract other countries from looking at what El Salvador is doing. And so they don't follow suit. Number 5, the founding fathers of hyper-Bitcoinization. So again, after this speech that he addressed to the United Nations, President Nayib Bukele put out an article called Stop Drinking at Least Kool-Aid, which is an article that I highly recommend you reading. In this article, which I actually have here open, he goes on, in this article, President Bukele goes on and speaks about all the great things that have happened since September 7th, 2021, and how the country has benefited from moving over to Bitcoin. One of the things that he speaks about, and I'll just go down here, I will put this in the link. He speaks about that, over 2020, they've had 10.3% income from tourism, increase in income from tourism, 52% increase in employment, 7% increase in new businesses, 12% increase in exports, 17% increase in energy, 19% increase in internal revenue, 37% energy exports, increase in energy exports, with energy exports going up by 3.3,000%, and a 95% decrease in violence. These are facts that you will not see on mainstream media because they want to focus on those few that are not happy with the Bitcoin adoption. And even though there are some people in El Salvador that still have not adopted Bitcoin, there's still people that may be resistant to it, the overall of the country, the overall sentiment in the country has been quite positive towards Bitcoin, as we're going to discover further in this video. And further than that, the President Bukele has invited people from 44 different countries, 32 central bankers, and 12 financial authorities from 44 different developing countries, and invited them over on May 15th, over to El Salvador, where he spoke to them about Bitcoin and how Bitcoin is changing the country and how Bitcoin is good for inclusion and for helping banking the unbanked. This is a huge move where he's showing other developing countries what they can do for their people. Now, if these countries start to follow suit, especially with the upcoming bull market in 2024, we're going to see a lot of countries start to realize that Bitcoin is the right move. When El Salvador's Bitcoin starts increasing in value and we start to have a bull run and they start making heaps and heaps of profit, then people are going to realize, especially bankers and central bankers around the world and developing countries, they're going to realize how this is an important and the right move for their people. So El Salvador had its first follower. So in March 2022, as I mentioned earlier, Lugano followed where President Bukele had led, and the Swiss city made Bitcoin de facto legal tender. And this was the first move in Europe by a Swiss city to make Bitcoin a legal tender. Following that, in October last year, they announced the first ever Bitcoin embassy, which was the birth of the Bitcoin diplomacy. El Salvador announced that they're going to be building a Bitcoin embassy in Nagano and creating more relations and more communication between the city and the country. The Jimmy Song 7. So educator Jimmy Song, if you don't know who he is, he's very, very popular on Twitter. He's a big Bitcoin educator, travels around the world to teach people about Bitcoin. He came over to El Salvador and started teaching the coders how to code on Bitcoin. Further than that, El Salvador then created the first ever Bitcoin diploma for high school students. And what we found was over 11,000 students received their Bitcoin diploma in 2022. This is the first time, and not only is it the first time, it's very rare in most schools to teach people about financial education. Most schools we come from in the West, they don't teach you about financial education. They don't teach you how to take care of your money. They don't teach you how to create wealth, because the main thing that they teach in schools these days is for people how to be employees. Then we also got the Bitcoin Beach, which was one of the original Bitcoin orange peeling beaches, where they educated over 1,000 locals, both on surf, English, as well as Bitcoin. They taught them also about computers. So you can see that with Bitcoin being in El Salvador, many entrepreneurs are coming into the country to start businesses, to deploy more education for people, and to help people understand why Bitcoin is the solution and why Bitcoin is freedom, or Bitcoin equals peace for humanity. We also see that despite the newfound fame, Bitcoin Beach continued in 2022 to put in the hard work. They opened up Hope House Punta Mango to help build a new story homes project in Lomas del Zonte, publishing Bitcoin Beach white paper. And in this white paper, they speak about how Bitcoin will help the local economy, how Bitcoin is the solution for the problems that they're facing. In November, one of the purest signals for Bitcoin conferences drew over 1,000 Bitcoiners from all around the world to El Salvador. So we can see here in Bitcoin times, where thousands of people had come over to to El Salvador to attend this Bitcoin conference. Number 15, Bitfinex. In 2022, Bitfinex proved to be a good friend to El Salvador. The Bitcoin exchange donated millions to victims of gangs and helped with hurricane relief. They injected capital far and wide to Bitcoin Beach and to El Salvadorian entrepreneurs. So as you can see, a lot of Bitcoiners are moving to El Salvador, are investing in El Salvador because they believe that this is the right way and it's the right move for humanity. In fact, the Freedom Manifesto was also launched by Bitfinex in 2020 and spoke about adopting Bitcoin in El Salvador, and it was launched at the Adopting Bitcoin conference in El Salvador. On top of that, number 16, Bitcoin investors coming to El Salvador. So what we saw in 2022, a lot of the Bitcoin OGs, a lot of the Bitcoin investors moved over to El Salvador. This included Paulo Ardiano, Ricardo B. Solanas, and Max Kaiser all moved over to Bitcoin. And Max Kaiser has been speaking about how much benefit Bitcoin has brought over to El Salvador. He's always tweeting about he's getting his El Salvadoran ID and how him and his wife Stacy have moved over to El Salvador. Buying back debt, one of the biggest things that the IMF and mainstream media spoke about with El Salvador moving to Bitcoin standard and also moving to Bitcoin being legal tender was that El Salvador was going to default on its debt. El Salvador proved them wrong, and they did so by buying back their 2023 debt as well as their 2025 debt, saving the country over $275 million. So the FUD was always wrong. As you can see, 17A, contrary to mainstream media reported, El Salvador did not default and will not default. In fact, repurchased a great deal of our debt at a significant discount, saving us $275 million. Now, a lot of the news articles that you'll see in mainstream media is about El Salvador losing money because the Bitcoin value went down due to the bear market and so forth. However, they have not lost any money because they haven't sold their Bitcoin. It's only paper losses. What they have done in real dollar terms is saved saved their population $275 million. Pensions promises kept. So El Salvador and President Bukele introduced pension reform. Not only that, they increased pensions by 30% to the pensioners without having to increase taxes. This stuff is really unheard of in the Western world. Most countries in the Western world are looking at reducing taxes, looking at increasing the age of retirement because they want to keep people working because of the aging population, while El Salvador is increasing pensions for their people. Betting big on El Salvador. With old debts paid, pension promises kept, and political and gang plunder stopped. 2022 was the year to turn around to build a brighter future. So they started building new infrastructure, new roads to new beaches, to open the country up to more innovation, more tourism, and more ways in which they can develop as a country. So not only that, they started building a new highway that's going to go across the nation to allow anybody that could participate, not just the wealthy and the elite, that anybody can go to El Salvador and enjoy the beautiful cities and the beautiful beaches there. Going over to 19B, a future worth fighting for. So building infrastructure was the first step, but they've also developed ways to clean up the country and looking after the environment, and they're now moving to a zero waste policy. So they're looking at cleaning up the country, getting rid of all the waste, and how can they reduce their environmental footprint on the world. Moving over to 19B or 19C, the place we want to be, where El Salvador is going to be the place we want to be. And if we want infrastructure projects to be built for all rather than plundered by the few, we must not tolerate corruption by the elite. So he's put a zero tolerance policy when it comes to corruption. If you know anything about the history of El Salvador, previous governments were corrupt and stole millions and millions and billions of dollars from their people. The same thing has happened in a lot of developing countries, such as Sri Lanka, Venezuela, Lebanon, Zimbabwe, where a lot of the people's wealth gets stolen by the elite of that country. Then he's also launched in November the Digital Assets Issuers Bill, which was introduced to generate volcano bonds. So these are volcano bonds because what they've done in El Salvador is they're using volcano power to mine for Bitcoin. So it's free renewable energy that they're using to power their mining mines, their Bitcoin mines in El Salvador. And now they're going to be issuing Bitcoin bonds where people around the world can invest in these bonds and be able to mine and get more Bitcoin. And last but not least, El Salvador's president has got the highest approval rating of all of Latin America. You can see in this photo here that he's got 86% approval rating compared to the other countries like Costa Rica, which has got 81%, República Dominicana has got 68, 62, all the way down to 17%. So he's the most popular and the most accepted president in all of Latin America. Now, why have I shown you this and what's the conclusion here? The conclusion that we want to get to, by El Salvador moving over to Bitcoin and making it legal tender, this was the right move for the country. It was the right move for the people. And it's shown throughout 2020, which was a horrific year for crypto, with a horrific year on an economic front all around the world. But El Salvador kept on growing when the rest of the world was shrinking and struggling with financial issues and economic issues. Whether it was the US, whether it's the UK, Australia, mostly Europe, most of the Western world is struggling. Most of the world in general, any country that's on a fiat standard has been struggling throughout 2022. But El Salvador, being on a Bitcoin, having Bitcoin as a legal tender, they have grown and shined throughout 2022 and really working towards becoming a financial hub of the new economic system. I hope you enjoyed this video, guys. If you did enjoy it, make sure you press the like, smash that like and subscribe. And don't forget to hit the notification bell so you get to see every single time that we create videos or we upload videos. Make sure you follow us on TikTok as well as YouTube and Facebook. Until next week, have a great week. Peace out. And as always, stay crypto.